example, wheat protein is not a very high quality protein in the context of its amino acid structure, but it's content, but it's not that bad. But then when you couple the fact that only 50% of it is digested as true amino acid absorption, then you can see that it is a very weak protein as compared to a high protein such as whey protein or milk protein that not only has a better profile of essential amino acids, but also is digested faster. So keep in mind when I say that the average intake of the dietary protein is the official recommendation is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day. But what people have forgotten about that recommendation is that that's of high quality protein, meaning that it's fully digested and has a profile of amino acids that is very beneficial. But in most circumstances, the dietary intake of protein, it will be beneficial to have a higher protein intake than that basal amount.
A special thank you to One Farm for sponsoring this episode of the show. One Farm is a farm-to-supplement company that produces products designed to improve people's lives. They use whole organic ingredients sourced directly from the farmers that grow them. And let me just tell you, I have been using One Farm CBD for many years, and now they have a gut health product, which is absolutely delicious. And it is a bone broth that has been enhanced with other botanicals, adaptogens to help support a healthy microbiome for more gut diversity, which we know is important. It's bone broth from grass-fed organic beef. It has garlic and onions from Keen garlic that's grown organic, chamomile marshmallow. Again, these are all from very small family-run farms, which is incredible. 1 to 2 scoops in warm water, you drink the broth. It comes with or without CBD. And this month, One Farm is offering my listeners a free gut health superfood. All you have to do is pay $5 for shipping. Go to onefarm.com. That's ONE farm.com and put in the code LYONGH. That's LYONGH. For gut health, of course, and you will get a free gut health superfood. Bob Wolfe, I'm so excited to have you here, by the way. Do you know that that your work has made some of the biggest impact on my trajectory in my career?
Well, that's great to hear. You're around long enough, and there'll be somebody that has listened to you. And one of the things that in my career, I had over 50 postdocs and about 20 PhD students. And one of the things that it involved a lot of hassle because the program in metabolic physiology wasn't existent. So I had to start it and go through all the administrative hoops. But came to realize that, by yourself, you can only do so much research and make whatever contribution you can. But through influencing other people, you have a much broader chance of actually making contact and influencing people. And so it's just great to hear that you actually had that I had some impact on the direction that your work has gone.
You have. You've actually had quite a significant impact. So Don Layman has trained me for the last 20 years.
Oh, okay. Well, Don has probably told you that we're very good friends. In fact, Don came down to Galveston when I was at UTMB for his sabbatical, and we worked together then. So that's a small world. So it's great.
It's pretty amazing. I have a lot of questions for you, but before I get into some of these questions, I really want to highlight some of the massive contributions that you have made in the scientific literature and really in the science space. Number one, stable isotopes. The way you really brought that to the forefront. This is the way that we look at metabolism. So thank you for doing that. The other thing is, there's a lot of discussion about the Randle hypothesis. And so the Randle hypothesis, and I'm sorry that this may be a little technical for some of the listeners, but the glucose fatty acid cycle, you came out with a very pivotal paper in, I believe, the 90s, where you wrote about it, that really this glucose fatty acid cycle is that we've kind of got it wrong. And that was just so significant. And then finally, and certainly not in this order, your work has really inspired so many others, that your paper, The Underappreciated Role of Muscle, has just inspired so many people. So thank you for all the massive contributions that you've had.
Oh, thank you. That's very good to hear. But interestingly, I was just in the process of doing a talk. I'm giving a talk in Korea in a few in a month or two, plenary lecture at a big metabolic meeting, and they sort of asked me to give a review of 50 years of research, which doesn't, boils down to definitely only a few highlights. But one of the things that is interesting that I sort of focused on the Randle hypothesis, because the glucose fatty acid cycle, I think people have always just blithely referred to that as like this is the way it is, without really understanding exactly what controls the balance between fatty acid and glucose metabolism. And so I went through in this talk, went through all the background and research, and realized that most of the people in the audience hadn't been born when I had was doing that work. So it goes to show that hang around long enough, and some things get appreciated. But thanks for bringing those points up, because it means a lot that they had an impact on you.
Yeah, and I think that by my goal at the end of this podcast is really for you to highlight some of this pivotal work that you have done, because where you absolutely excel is in metabolism. As a metabolic researcher, you are exceptional. And with many researchers, your work is not necessarily accessible, and you are not necessarily accessible to the general public. And so they're the things that I really, I think are so important. For example, this glucose fatty acid cycle. Can you explain a little bit about the Randle hypothesis, what its impact is if we believe that fats dominate metabolism versus glucose, and kind of how that changes our perspective from the Randle hypothesis to the reverse, which is what you highlighted, and what that means to the listener, to the patient?
Sure. Well, what the basic hypothesis put forth by Randall and Newsom back in 1963, based parenthetically purely on in vitro enzyme analysis. It wasn't ever any kind of metabolic study that led them to this conclusion. But the the general topic was what controls the balance between carbohydrate oxidation and fatty acid oxidation to provide the metabolic energy to perform functions, even like physical activity or just daily functions. And their theory was that the availability of fatty acid dominated, and that as fatty acid levels became more abundant, that this had an inhibitory effect on the oxidation of glucose, and that as the fatty acid levels decreased, the glucose oxidation rose. And we did a series of two fairly straightforward experiments in human subjects testing the hypothesis, in which case, one, we had a high rate of carbohydrate oxidation dictated by glucose infusion, glucose intake, so that 100% of the energy was coming from glucose oxidation, and then had a 20-fold increase in fatty acid availability. And according to the theory, it should have inhibited glucose oxidation, but in fact had no impact at all. And then we did the reverse, where we had normalized a high level of fatty acid oxidation by infusing a substance called intralipid, which is a lipid emulsion. And in that case, we raised the fatty acid concentrations to very high levels, and 100% of the oxidation balance between the two came from the oxidation of fat, and then infused glucose. And as glucose was infused, there was a direct inhibition of the fatty acid oxidation. And we followed that up with more mechanistic studies, where we showed the exact place in which, or metabolic site where this occurred, that as fatty acids are transported into the mitochondria, that the enzyme responsible for that is actually directly inhibited by glucose. So that not only was the general concept shown to be exactly the reverse, that the availability of glucose dictates the substrate of metabolism, but actually we demonstrated the specific site of control. So that the upside of this was that in situations where we're trying to lose fat, if we take it to a very generic, thing that everybody's interested in, well, as long as the carbohydrate intake is prevalent or high, the oxidation of fat is going to be completely shut off, and even in cases like exercise, where the goal is to be oxidizing fat, it's only at a low level of activity that you get a very significant contribution of fat oxidation, because as the intensity of exercise goes up, the oxidation of glucose becomes more prominent, and that inhibits the fatty acid oxidation. So at higher levels of exercise, the oxidation of fatty acid actually goes down as compared to where it was in the lighter exercise. And this kind of led in the popular, that sort of fundamental observation. Now, the paper that specifically described that in exercise has been cited over 4,000 times, and it really was the foundation for the concept of the fat burning zone that you get. Like if you get on the elliptical, you'll see if you're working in the fat burning zone, and it's usually well below the highest intensity. And I think it did kind of change people's perspective on exercise for weight control, because what it showed was that to maximize fatty acid oxidation, you really didn't need to have a tremendously high exertion, but rather the length of time at a low level of energy expenditure more directly fueled the oxidation of fat. And I think more generally, I think in the context of diabetes, the idea that increased fatty acid availability was causing insulin resistance and increase in blood glucose turned out to really be not the case at all. And that has been followed through with studies for the last 20 years, 30 years since those initial studies that we did. And the whole concept of how the blood glucose level is controlled, I think, has been affected by the realization that the availability of glucose, not fatty acids, are really what dictates substrate metabolism. And that's why we sort of coined it the glucose fatty acid cycle reverse, because it actually works the exact opposite of the. And parenthetically, Eric Newsom, who that work was the original glucose fatty acid cycle was his PhD thesis. I got to know him quite well, really, not through academics, but because we were both marathon runners. And he ultimately conceded that he had it wrong. So unfortunately, he's deceased now, and he never really published that. But I can tell you that he agreed with the fact that really in the physical, and I think that the real take-home message is that the physiology in human subjects dictated exactly the opposite response of what was dictated by measurement of enzyme activity and presuming that related to some sort of metabolic flux in vivo. So I think that we could take a broader picture of that whole thing with the glucose fatty acid cycle and realize that using in vivo, in intact human subjects, that even though it was much less invasive procedures are possible, nonetheless, that it really has to be done in human subjects, because that's really the only circumstance in which you really get a true picture of what the metabolic control mechanisms are.
Yeah. And I think what was so helpful first of all, thank you so much for that history. Again, you are the person that really, this came out of your lab. And this understanding, which I think is so fascinating, is that there's this conversation about how we're eating too much fat. And maybe it's not that it's an excess fat issue or excess glucose issue. Potentially, is it an excess calorie issue?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a take-home message of the of what I've just sort of said in kind of a deep dive. The point is that that whether it's carbohydrate or fat, the caloric balance is really the dictator of whether you have a positive energy balance or negative energy balance, and there's really no escaping that. And whether it's fat or carbohydrate, it really doesn't make a difference. And I think that has led to a lot of misconceptions. Is the idea that a low-fat diet is going to be beneficial. If it's a high carbohydrate diet, realize that the high carbohydrate is going to inhibit fatty acid oxidation. So, it all comes out in the wash. It's just how many calories you eat, whether it's carbohydrate or fat, that's going to be the predominant factor in energy balance.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because my next question was, well, now how do we place the Dean Ornish diet. So Dean Ornish is 10% fat versus a ketogenic style diet. Where does all of this kind of fit into health?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think the thing that it's kind of like people ask, "What's the best exercise?" And the answer is really whatever you'll do. And I think that when we just discuss the fact that the caloric balance is really the bottom line, that these different diets are just different ways to approach eating, so that people might find it tolerable to live in a hypocaloric state, because it's really not a natural physiological state to be eating less calories than you're burning. And people have a really tough time staying with that. And the ultimate, whatever the type of diet is, the ultimate deciding factor in its effectiveness is the caloric balance. That being said, though, I think there's another sort of subcomponent that we want to think about, and it really sort of touches on the third issue that you pointed out at the beginning. That is the role of muscle and metabolic regulation beyond just physical function. Because I think that the energy balance is the key thing. Realize that the muscle protein is in a constant state of turnover, meaning synthesis and breakdown is occurring constantly. And there's an energy cost of that turnover, which is about 1/3 of the total resting energy expenditure. So that if you have a large muscle mass, large active muscle mass, the metabolic expenditure of that protein turnover is going to contribute to the energy uh, use in the individual, so that the energy balance will be helped not only by just the calories during exercise, but just the fact that you have a larger muscle mass, then the energy expenditure just related to the basal turnover of that protein will contribute to an energy expenditure side of the equation. So that within the context of diets that promote use of either fat or carbohydrate, really the crucial factor is how much protein is in the diet. That gives a higher rate of protein turnover and energy expenditure in response to the meal intake, as well as maintaining a greater muscle mass, which will maintain a greater energy expenditure over time in the basal state, and contribute to an energy balance over a long period of time.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for talking about protein, because we're definitely going to do that. When you talk about dietary protein, do you think, and I have a handful of questions. Number one, how much protein do you recommend, do you think is necessary?
Well, I've spent a lot of time over the past several years with working with the FAO, WHO on quantifying protein quality. And I think that the question of how much protein should you eat is really a subtopic, and that is that it makes a big difference what the type of protein is. And what we've been working on is developing and validating a system of evaluating protein quality that's dependent not only on the amount of protein you eat, but the specific nature of the protein, namely the profile and amount of essential amino acids in the protein, as well as how well it's digested. And for example, wheat protein is not a very high quality protein in the context of its amino acid structure, but its content, but it's not that bad. But then when you couple the fact that only 50% of it is digested as true amino acid absorption, then you can see that it is a very weak protein as compared to a high quality protein such as whey protein or milk protein, that not only has a better profile of essential amino acids, but also is digested faster. So keep in mind when I say that the average intake of the dietary protein is the official recommendation is zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day. But what people have forgotten about that recommendation is that that's of high quality protein, meaning that it's fully digested and has a profile of amino acids that is very beneficial. But in most circumstances, the dietary intake of protein it will be beneficial to have a higher protein intake than that basal amount. The dietary requirement of protein, or the RDA for protein, is predicated on the amount of protein intake you need to avoid deficiencies, so that you don't start losing hair and having other problems of protein deficiency if you eat 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day. that's a very low level of protein intake. And in fact, when we look at it in comparison to the American diet, most people are eating well in excess of that, and yet still benefit from increasing their dietary protein intake. So at a very conservative level, I think that there's a general consensus that as you get older, you need to eat a higher level of protein intake, at least 1.2 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram per day. If you're in a very intense physical circumstance, such as exercise or military training or anything that really requires a lot of physical activity, it will be beneficial to eat a higher protein intake as well. We did a pretty large study in weight loss showing that to maintain muscle mass and weight loss, that you have to have at least 1.2 grams per kilogram per day of dietary protein, which when you multiply it out presents a big problem in obesity, because if you weigh 35 or 40, if you have a BMI of 35 or 40, you have so much body weight that the amount of protein necessary to maintain your muscle mass at 1.2 grams per kilogram per day will mean that it's almost impossible to lose weight, because you're going to have so many calories just to meet protein requirements that you can't maintain your you can't meet the caloric requirements of caloric restriction weight loss. And that's one of the big dilemmas of caloric restriction weight loss diets, is that you can't really eat enough protein to have a great success in maintaining muscle mass. And so the most common, almost all diets result in some degree of loss of muscle mass. And then that kind of works against you, because as your muscle mass goes down, your basal metabolism goes down, and your amount of calories you eat to balance your energy expenditure actually goes down over time. So all of it is a cycle that really is a difficult challenge, and that's where the specific dietary intake of certain proteins that are high in essential amino acids that have direct anabolic effects is really an important factor.
Let's say an individual is looking to lose weight. They're looking to lose weight. Their diet is higher in protein. Would it be difficult? So what is the way to say it? Basically, I'll just ask the question straight out. How difficult is it to gain weight on lean forms of dietary protein?
Yeah, the loss of weight is very difficult to accomplish without losing muscle as well. The biggest example and most controlled is bariatric surgery, where a big study was done pooling data from many, many institutions and maybe several hundred people. And the average average loss of lean body mass was something like 27 kilograms. So that it's really a challenge to lose weight without losing muscle mass. And the idea of doing it with a high protein diet is that you're going to reduce the rate of muscle loss, and then that will have a lot of beneficial effects. And so it's the best you can do. If you're going to try to lose weight with a diet, a high protein diet is clearly the best route to accomplish that with.
This episode is brought to you by Cozy Earth. Let me just tell you, summer is hot, and summer is really hot in Houston. I love my Cozy Earth sheets. I sleep really comfortably. I know exactly when I am not on Cozy Earth sheets because I am up, it is hot, the other sheets are sticky. I love Cozy Earth. They are soft and breathable, temperature regulating sheets. If you don't like it, they'll refund your purchase price plus shipping, no questions asked, and you get 100 nights to try out Cozy Earth sheets. That's right, 100 nights. And why do they make that guarantee? Because Cozy Earth is amazing. And right now, friends, I'm so excited to tell you that in time for summer, you will get 40% off. That's right. 40% off. Go to cozyearth.com/Dr. Lyon and put in the code Dr. Lyon at checkout. That's cozyearth.com/Dr. Lyon. or use the code Dr. Lyon at checkout. I've been using these sheets for so long. When I find a company I love, I really stick with it. Once you try these sheets, you will look forward to getting into bed. It's made from viscose from bamboo, so it traps less heat. It's very breathable, and it's so beautiful. CozyEarth.com/Dr. Lyon.
That being said, it's a challenge because, as I said, when you have a high protein diet, that doesn't leave much room for the other calories that you tend to eat in your diet. So that's why things like the Atkins diet, if you eat that much protein, you get calories come along with it because of the content in food products, and it's a real challenge. And I think people are finding this, that it's very difficult. It's not any newsflash. It's very difficult to sustain weight loss with caloric restriction because you lose muscle mass, and as you lose muscle mass, your metabolic rate goes down, and the amount of calories you can eat in a day to maintain energy balance goes down. So that it's really tough. But the best you can do is a high protein diet. But I just think it's necessary to appreciate that really, that's kind of, no matter what you do, it's kind of closing the barn door after the horse got out. And everybody's interested in weight loss, but what we really should be more focused on is preventing weight gain, because we're still at a point in the dietary balance that we can accomplish that goal. The weight loss has proven to be a real challenge.
This, when you're talking about preventing weight gain, this paper, The Underappreciated Role of Muscle, you started talking about muscle decades before people even thought about it. Everyone has been focused on adiposity for decades. Why muscle? Why did you write that paper, The Underappreciated Role of Muscle?
Well, I think we think about muscle entirely in terms of physical performance, and yet muscle plays a key metabolic role in a lot of respects. Uh, there are a lot of tissues in the body that just can't, all proteins in the body are in a continuous state of turnover, meaning they're being broken down and replaced by newer, better functioning proteins. And this process of protein turnover causes energy, requires energy that is responsible for the basic metabolic rate. And a lot of these tissues that are constantly breaking down their protein and regenerating it can't afford to lose mass. You can't afford to lose that much of your heart muscle. You can't afford to lose your skin. These certain tissues and organs are really dependent on a constant supply of amino acids to maintain their mass and function. And yet, that's not the way we live. We eat dinner at night. We might be 15 to 20 hours before any more protein is ingested the next day. So we have a long period of time with no amino acids coming into the blood from the diet. And the amino acids are maintained at the normal level by the result of net protein breakdown. So that the protein in muscle really serves as the reservoir to provide the precursors for these other tissues and organs that can't afford to go any significant period of time. And in fact, it's so striking that even after 2 to 3 weeks of total starvation, the plasma amino acid levels are still maintained. In the Belfast studies, where the Irish hunger strikers were asking to have their blood measured every day, just as hope that some scientific benefit would come out of their sacrifice of starving themselves to death. And the most striking aspect of those studies was after 40 days of starvation was the first time that the blood levels of amino acids started to drop. And once the muscle had been so depleted that they couldn't maintain, the breakdown of muscle protein was too depleted to maintain normal blood levels of amino acids for things like the heart and brain to utilize for protein synthesis, that was the time at which they died. And, obviously we don't go to that extreme in our daily lives, but it may be at least 20 hours between protein intake and a person's daily activity. And so the muscle mass is important in being able to provide those amino acids that have to be used by tissues to actually maintain their function, even in the absence of dietary intake of protein or amino acids.
Which would then lead us to the conversation about dietary protein and dietary protein distribution. What are some of your thoughts on dietary protein distribution?
Well, we tried hard. The idea is that that there's only a certain amount of protein synthesis that can be generated in any particular meal. And it does make sense, but it's been a tough concept to prove. The idea would be that you'd be better off eating 30 grams of protein with each meal than eating a low protein breakfast and low protein lunch and a lot higher amount at dinner time. I think that in terms of protein synthesis, there's a pretty good basis for that theory. In terms of the total gain of protein, if you take into account the breakdown effect as well, what we found was that up to a certain level, the primary action of dietary intake of protein is to stimulate protein synthesis. But then as you go, there's a certain limit to that, and people have put that around 30 grams of protein, but I think it depends a lot on what else is in the meal and what type of protein you eat. But let's just say 30 grams of protein maximizes protein synthesis. But as you go to higher levels of protein intake in the meal, protein breakdown begins to be inhibited. And so the gain in body protein can still be augmented beyond that amount of dietary protein by a suppression of protein breakdown. So it depends what your goal is. The argument is that slowing protein breakdown down is not really advantageous because the turnover of proteins, as I said, is how the older ones are broken down and they're renewed with better functioning proteins, and that's not going to occur by virtue of a suppression of breakdown. So that the net gain of protein is not really dependent on the pattern of eating, but it may well be that, and there's a good theoretical basis still for assuming that by better distribution throughout the day that you maintain a higher synthetic rate and a greater functionality of the protein turnover. So I'd say the jury is still out on that. It's not been it was a theory that was very attractive when it was first put out, and it's been a challenge to directly confirm it, but I think there's still some merit and some aspects of it that are worth thinking about. I think just common sense tells us that eating some protein at all meals that kind of distribution is going to be more effective than eating most of your protein at dinner, which is the general pattern that people follow. It's just been a little bit difficult to prove conclusively that it really makes a difference.
Yeah. Don was also talking about that as well. What about the first meal? So most of the studies are done at breakfast as opposed to a lunch or dinner meal as it relates to protein intake, protein distribution. Why is that?
Well, it's purely a methodological thing, and that is you can have a period of a real basal state, and then you give the meal and you get a response over the next several hours. The problem with looking at lunch and dinner is that what you had for breakfast will affect the response to lunch because the response will the blood levels of some of the things you've eaten will still be elevated, and then when you eat for lunch and when you ate lunch, it will be affected. Will have an impact on dinner. But I think it does have an impact, and it's difficult to sometimes sort out what it's due to because we did a study a few years ago which showed that eating the same diet at 6 p.m. or at 10 p.m. had a significant difference in terms of the metabolic response overnight during sleep, so that the eating a diet late at night had, as I said, a different metabolic response than eating it earlier, which could be due to the fact that you're closer to sleeping, or it could be due to the fact that the previous breakfast and lunch are still having an impact on the deposition of the dinner. So I think it's a methodological thing, but it's an important point that you mentioned, and all our studies are done in the morning because it's the most convenient time. We don't have any impact of the previous meals, but we know, for example, we did a study several years back. Stu Phillips did this study in our lab, and that was doing an exercise study and showing that the effect of the exercise, the anabolic effect of amino acids after exercise, was still enhanced 2 days after the exercise. So you get this building up or compounding of the effects of one meal and the next, and it becomes. We've tried to circumvent this more recently by focusing on at least 1 day or even 3 days total protein turnover. But it's a real challenge because you got a lot of permutations of diets and timings and amount in each meal and everything to deal with, which makes it
It is challenging, and you're
it's
bringing up a really
this
good
is
point.
why
I just
people
want to
don't like
highlight it
doing
for the
human
listener. And
studies.
some of this conversation is a bit technical, but it's really important. Just this concept that many of the studies are done for in the morning because of that basal rate, where there's no influence directly of food the night before. The other thing that I think is really important to point out is that protein research, muscle research is definitely very challenging. The metabolic dynamic of the human is very challenging. It's interesting because as individuals age, it seems as if the protein requirements go up, anabolic resistance potentially happens, and there's a whole host of things. What role does exercise play in the relationship of substrate utilization? Oftentimes people think about aerobic activity and carbohydrates, but what about aerobic activity and protein?
Yeah. The exercise is the most effective way to stimulate this process of breakdown of amino acids and proteins that are not functioning as effectively as when they're new, and replacing those with newer proteins. And so this concept of protein turnover and acceleration of protein turnover is really the key thing that degenerates as we get older. The muscle mass goes down. A lot of people have paid most attention to that, but really it's this functionality of the muscle as you get older that matters. As you get older, the amount of muscle you have is much less concern to most people than whether you can actually walk out to the mailbox and get the mail. And so I think that the exercise is really the most effective way to stimulate this process. Eating adequate high quality protein will amplify the response, so that it's not just an additive effect. The beneficial effect of exercise, aerobic exercise, or anabolic or weightlifting, has an acute effect which really helps the muscle. But there has to be an increased supply of amino acids from muscle, from dietary fat, protein rather, to provide the building blocks to replace the proteins that are broken down at an accelerated rate. So that there's an interaction that when you do the exercise and add high quality protein intake, you get a bigger response than the individual effect of either one alone. The exercise has a beneficial effect, but the high protein does as well because of the fact that you got to have
And that would
building blocks to make the new protein, and that's what the dietary protein provides. So you really need both. And unfortunately, as people get older, for whatever reason, dietary patterns indicate that people tend to eat less high quality protein as they get older, which is a big mistake. And it's just about equal in problems to cutting down the exercise, both of which are important and both work together synergistically.
Yeah, especially when this is the biggest challenge, I think, when people are talking about going plant-based, is it's not the younger individuals per se that it impacts. It's really the older individuals, because if they're getting this information and they're hearing these messages to cut back high quality protein, I worry about their ability to address protein turnover. Not necessarily if they would feel it, but over a period of time, thinking about how they'll be able to recover and just muscle quality. And as their appetite decreases, if they're going to reduce high quality protein, then the protein sources that they're going to pull upon and rely on are going to have a lot more carbohydrates, slower digestibility, poor digestibility. It's just going to become a real problem.
Well, what you said is just right on the money. And I think that that's what is underappreciated. I think that people, if being working at a Center for Aging, I've had a lot of impact or influence by people just asking them about their diet and what they're trying to accomplish, and that's sort of the most common thought, is that I'm cutting down red meat intake for health purposes, and then you ask, well, what is it about the red meat that well, it's just what we're told, that we should be eating less. But the problem, like you said, is that there's aspects that people don't appreciate. For one, if you maintain the same protein intake of the plant-based diet, you're going to eat many more calories, and mostly in the form of carbohydrate. And as you get old, the insulin resistance is an issue which is amplified by high carbohydrate intake. So that the plant-based diet really has the potential to have detrimental effects, not only not to be beneficial health in terms of health, but not only not beneficial, but actually detrimental to a more well-balanced diet. I think that the other thing that is important to realize is that eating is a totally non-physiological perspective, but eating is an important function for older people because as your world kind of narrows, having meals and eating with other people and enjoying eating and so forth is one of the main pleasures that older people have. And this notion that we should be
You
forcing
look
them
great for
to eat.
25.
I say them as if it doesn't include me, but but yeah. But the point is that to make dietary sacrifices that aren't even rational, but even if they are, unless you really can document that this is going to make a major impact on people's lives as they get older, then you should really think twice about recommendation of it. But I do think that the heart of what you're saying is, people that are young that live on a plant-based diet will point to what they do and say, well, there's no problem. And I think what we have to appreciate is there's metabolic flexibility as you're younger that enables you really to make do with almost anything. And then as you get older, that becomes more and more restricted. And when you get over 65 or 70, it becomes a real limitation that the exact nature of the dietary intake becomes very important. And that's why we really should be paying more attention to what the health consequences of some of the recommendations that are out there.
Yeah, the unintended consequences of reducing high quality protein for an aging population or a sick population, I think, is going to be devastating. And ultimately, if I was a betting woman, I would say we're going to have an epidemic of sarcopenia and osteoporosis like we have never seen.
Yeah, I think that's people are living longer, but the problem is that with as you said, with loss of muscle mass and bone strength, the incidence of crippling diseases and lack of independence is going to become much more important.
Yes. And, I'm just going to mention this one point is that it's not even just all about the macronutrient protein, but there's low molecular weight bioactive compounds like creatine and carnosine, and then, of course, vitamins and minerals, which the nutrient density aspect of high quality protein is critical. So there's that, which moves us into exercise. Not exactly, but we're going to go right into exercise as it relates to fuels for exercise, because this is definitely within your strike zone of work that you've done a lot of as it relates to, oftentimes people who do aerobic activity always think that they need carbohydrates. May be true, but what about their protein need?
Yeah, I think that the thing that's been the general concept has long been that it doesn't matter how much protein you eat because the you really don't need much protein. And if you look at the top athletes, endurance athletes, they don't eat much protein. And what people miss is that the caloric requirement of world-class endurance training may be 5 to 6, even 8,000 calories a day. So that even if you eat a very low-calorie diet, a low-protein diet, that you're still eating a whole lot of protein. And the Kenyan runners that eat this gruel for their main substance have been cited as though they look at how well they do on a low protein diet. And if you look at the actual amount of protein they eat, it's over 2 grams of protein per kilogram per day because they eat so much. They're using 5 or 6,000 calories a day, so that it's nothing new to advocate that you have to have a high quality protein as a component of the dietary intake, particularly if we're not world class athletes. There may be certain sports that you want to have sort of an unusual diet in terms of maximizing performance relative to body weight or something. But for most people that are just recreational athletes, the whole benefit of the exercise is more on the quality of muscle and its action in metabolic regulation and its function physically than is the case with the extra calories. Because the problem with exercise as a caloric for purely for weight loss is that you definitely have your appetite stimulated by doing aerobic exercise. So, if you have the willpower to both do the exercise and not eat as much, then that will enhance your rate of loss, certainly, but that can be harder than it seems. So I think the main thing we need to consider in supplying the energy for exercise is that dietary protein should be a central part of the dietary intake. High carbohydrate is particularly helpful in exercises where you're really depleting your glycogen stores, but realize that that's really extensive exercise, and most people are not even touching their muscle glycogen stores. So that
What would be an example of exercise that would deplete muscle glycogen?
well, working at about 70 or 80% of max for at least an hour, and it could be even more than that. In a marathon, probably with a well-trained subject, it may be as long as an hour and a half of racing before the muscle glycogen is depleted. So that if you look at the breakdown of substrate metabolism during exercise, at 50% of maximal effort, you're really not using much muscle glycogen at all. It's only when you start getting really high intensity exercise that you start using the muscle glycogen. And most people that aren't highly trained can't really sustain that, a high level of intensity for very long. So that I think that the concept of lots of carbs has been overstated. I think that the most important thing is to maintain a balanced diet with a healthy amount of high quality protein as a component of the diet with the aerobic exercise.
Special thank you to First Form for sponsoring this episode of the show. I would love, with all this talk, to highlight their essential amino acid mix. How do you use essential amino acids? Well, if your diet is lower in protein, if you're having a meal that is also lower in protein, you can use essential amino acids to help augment that. First Form has a whole host of flavors of this product, whether it's blood orange or berry blast or lemon drop. If you want to get fancy, then you can do pineapple, orange, banana, whatever it is that you choose. Essential amino acids can be very valuable. Basically, a scoop of essential amino acids with a lower protein meal can help increase the protein value of your meal. It's good for muscle protein synthesis, for energy, for focus, for recovery. Head on over to firstform.com/Dr. Lyon, firstform, PHORM.com/Dr. Lyon, and you can try whichever flavor that you like. Head on over to firstform.com/Dr. Lyon. What role does leucine play in substrate utilization in aerobic exercise?
Well, leucine is the specific amino acid that is cited to have not only importance with regard to the fact that it's the most abundant essential amino acid in muscle protein, but also that it may have, in a lot of circumstances, regulatory role beyond just its component of muscle protein. So that dietary intake of proteins that have a high proportion of leucine may stimulate the whole molecular mechanism involved in the activation of the synthetic process. So that leucine, as a specific component of dietary protein, may be able to actually enhance the metabolic response more than just as the fact that you're supplying a component of protein, but that it plays a metabolic regulatory role. Keeping in mind, though, that the amount of protein that needs to be eaten to get the plasma level of leucine up high enough to exert this regulatory role is pretty significant. So that this is why, as you get to a higher level of protein intake, you start seeing maybe unexpectedly disproportionate beneficial effects, because now you're getting up to the level of intake where the blood levels of amino acids, including leucine, get high enough to activate the whole molecular process of initiation of protein synthesis, which at low levels of protein intake really aren't activated by dietary protein intake.
This all, I would say, probably lends itself to distribution being important.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely the idea that if you hit that level 3 times in a day, that you're going to activate protein synthesis. You got to eat a fair amount to get it. If you have a small amount of dietary protein for breakfast, you're not activating any kind of activation of the whole molecular process supporting protein synthesis, because the amount of leucine in the diet is just not high enough to activate that process.
Yes, that definitely makes sense. And arguably, I always wonder, is the middle meal very important, because potentially initiation factors are already up at that middle meal. But clinically, what we do in our clinic is that first and last meal are very relevant. And then the middle meal, we think, okay, could it be an even distribution? Yes, potentially, because that allows for mitigating hunger and all the things that you have said. What is the role of branched chain amino acids as a supplement?
Well, I think that the branched chain amino acids are important. Really, the leucine is the one that has been demonstrated to have some specific regulatory roles. But the metabolism or breakdown of dietary leucine is occurs because of the activity of an enzyme which also breaks down and oxidizes the isoleucine and valine, the other two branched chain amino acids. So when you provide leucine alone, that you can have a deficiency in both isoleucine and valine because you're activating the oxidation of all of them. So the concept came across to provide all three branched chain amino acids and get the stimulatory effect due to leucine and not develop a deficiency in the other branched chain amino acids. The shortcoming of this approach in humans has been that you really need some of all the rest of the essential amino acids as well. That if you activate the process of initiation of synthesis with leucine, that the only increase in synthesis you can get is a more efficient reutilization of what amino acids are available for breakdown, so that when combined with the other essential amino acids as exogenous precursors, then the combination of the BCAAs and the other essential amino acids becomes more effective than just the branched chain amino acids alone.
Yeah, you did a really great paper. I don't know how long ago it was, but it really talked about how there was no utilization for branched chain amino acids as a dietary supplement, which
Yeah, I mean, I think that I wouldn't say no utilization. I think that it's an important component, but very limited without extra amino acids in the diet, because if you just think about it, essential amino acids are very effectively utilized to begin with. And that's all you got to be as precursors for new protein synthesis. It's going to be quite limited. But then if you combine those amino acids with other essential amino acids, a high proportion can be particularly useful in aging or other anabolic resistant states. So I think it's important to recognize that my take on that was not that there's no value, but only that the value of the BCAAs alone or leucine alone is quite limited as compared to utilization of a balanced mixture that has the BCAAs in it as a prominent component, but also all the other essentials as well.
Well, in terms of supplementation, what I'm hearing you say is that branched chain amino acids can be helpful if someone is eating potentially a lower protein diet, as long as all the essential amino acids are available. So you wouldn't have a BCAA drink on its own or a branched chain amino acid mix on its own. You would have it with a complete protein, essentially. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, I think in that circumstance, I don't know the extent to which that's been demonstrated, but I think that in theory that's the case. The limitation with what you proposed there is just the timing, that the free amino acids are absorbed so rapidly that, as compared to the dietary protein, that it really, what you said makes sense, but it hasn't really been demonstrated to be true.
Mm.
And I think before I was really agree to what you said, I'd have to see data demonstrating that it made a difference. because you get a spike in the BCAAs with the dietary supplement of the free amino acids, and it's back down to a low level when the slow rise of the amino acids from the dietary protein occurs. So I think it should work. We've done a study showing that a balanced mixture of essential amino acids can amplify the effect of dietary protein quite well. So I think probably true with the BCAAs, but you're still going to be limited in the end of the day by the availability of all the essential amino acids. So I think that by itself, I think there's little doubt that the BCAA supplementation is limited. But in combination with the meal or dietary protein supplement may still have a place as an effective anabolic agent.
Do you think that one thing or the other, so let me ask it this way. Would whole foods be better, or is there a place for an essential amino acid mixture? And when would that be beneficial?
Well, actually, I think that the whole foods are crucial, but the amino acid supplementation has quite a different response because free amino acids are absorbed directly. There's no digestion involved, so that you have 100% absorption, and also that the composition can be controlled to whatever you want it to be for whatever the optimal circumstance is, so that the spike in the concentrations of amino acids in the blood from a free amino acid supplement reach a peak way before you get with the dietary protein, and also at a much higher level. So you can provide a dietary supplement that will accomplish certain metabolic goals through its both the speed of absorption as well as the composition. It will have specific metabolic targets, which are not really feasible with a dietary protein that comes in much slower, and you can't change the composition of a dietary protein. So in that light, I have patents on, I think, 14 different formulations that, at least in theory, are targeting specific metabolic effects or actions that are benefited by having a particular formulation, not only just the quantity of essential amino acids, but for example, we have a formulation for reducing liver fat that blocks the methionine uptake in the liver by competitive transport. So we couldn't do this with a dietary protein because of the fact that all dietary protein has methionine in it. It's the first amino acid in the translation of mRNA. So you'll never have a diet that's deficient in methionine, but you can make a formulation of essential amino acids that is deficient in that specific amino acid in order to get a selective reduction in the activity relative to others. So they're kind of different things. I think that while I've been involved in developing different amino acid supplements, I never would want to lose the focus on the requirement or necessity of having a well-balanced dietary intake of high-quality proteins. The two things are actually a little bit separate in what their mechanism of action is.
That's very interesting to think that you can create different amino acid mixtures for very specific things, something like methionine, which sounds as if it's a methionine restriction, which would model say, vegan style diet. And to think that there are potentially other kinds of formulas or formulations would be pretty powerful and interesting to see. You've spoken about central fatigue hypothesis as it relates to whether it's a depletion of amino acids. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's a little bit right along the line of another example of how the formulation can make a difference, because the feeling of alertness and fatigue is governed to a significant extent by the neurotransmitters of dopamine and serotonin in the brain, both of which are produced from essential amino acids. The dopamine is produced from tyrosine, which is a derivative of phenylalanine, and the serotonin is derived from the metabolism of tryptophan. So by providing the idea is that as you get fatigued, that the branched chain amino acids are oxidized at a faster rate during intensive long-term exercise. So you start getting depletion in the branched chain amino acids relative to the tryptophan, so that the dopamine level drops relative to the serotonin, and your brain tells you you're tired, even though your muscles may still have something left. So the idea is to competitively inhibit the tryptophan uptake by giving a formulation that's high in the branched chain amino acids and phenylalanine, which are all transported into the brain by the same transporter as the tryptophan. But you provide all of those, and you don't have any tryptophan. You restore the normal ratio of the branched chain and large chain amino acids relative to tryptophan, and this will restore the balance between dopamine and serotonin, which not only will help prolong exercise, but it will actually give you greater cognitive capacity and kind of enthusiasm for getting started with the workout as well. So it's another example where there's a specific formulation which isn't designed particularly to promote protein synthesis so much as the production of neurotransmitters, which are also functions of essential amino acid intake.
So do these large neutral amino acids cross the blood-brain barrier?
Yeah, that's the whole point, that they're transported by a specific transporter, and all of them, tryptophan, phenylalanine, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, are all transported by the same transporter across the blood-brain barrier into the brain, so that we can, and there's a limited amount of them, so that if you give a high amount of one, you're going to limit the transport of the other, because there's just not enough transporters available to get them all into the brain. So that's sort of the general principle, that by giving a balance that favors the dopamine precursors, that you'll continue activation of enthusiasm or lack of mental fatigue. And of course, this is a tough one to show. I mean, in the theory, because of the fact that people quit exercise for a lot of reasons. I mean, it's not just because your dopamine level is dropped, but your legs can feel tired or you just don't feel like going on. The idea, though, is that by optimizing the dopamine to serotonin ratio, that you can improve this. And it's the same thing in a different circumstance with delirium, which is in a short-term cases in hospitals where people have a disruption of their normal amino acid levels. And again, this is a short-term response to a complete alteration of the balance between dopamine and serotonin. And that's another area in which the provision of a formulation heavy in the branched chain amino acids that are precursors to the dopamine is much more important than blocking the uptake of tryptophan, which is the serotonin precursor.
Delirium.
And this will help reduce the incidence of delirium. So there are just a lot of different applications that are possible. I think the thing that's most important to recognize is that this is a really rapidly growing field. That I described the first use of these essential amino acid supplement in like about 2000, and in 2015, just of what I found, there are almost 150 clinical trials worldwide in essential amino acids that have all shown some sort of positive effect. So it's a growing field, and we'll see where it goes. Which it's very difficult. One of the questions is it really make a difference? What your exact formulation is, and of course, those are difficult questions to answer because you're in intact humans and there are a lot of variables and so forth. So that as more studies are done, I think we'll learn a lot more about the applications and the limits of dietary essential amino acid supplements. But I think we can be pretty confident that there'll be a place for them in terms of nutritional guidance, but that they play a different role than dietary protein, and that there's both a limitation to their utility, but also an advantage that can't be achieved through dietary protein alone.
It'll be interesting to see if someone we'll be able to, they have tests where you can look at blood levels of amino acids, but that doesn't necessarily translate because that's not, depending on the amino acid, that's not where its primary location is. It So I don't know if
Yeah. We know that it's maintained pretty constant, so that
yes.
it makes
So
the
that is
interpretation
absolutely
difficult.
the point. I think it was Fernstrom that did a lot of some of the earlier research. Is that true? On tryptophan and serotonin. So
Yes.
you guys listening are ready to nerd out on some of that stuff. But Fernstrom did some of this early work.
Yeah, that was done way back in the
Yeah.
1970s. He didn't really ever capitalize on it and coming up with a formulation that people could benefit from, but the concept definitely originated with him.
I was very interested in it because I had been thinking a lot about, is there a way in which we can create a nutritional plan that leverages some of these various amino acid profiles? But I finally gave up in the way that not necessarily. And it's very difficult. Like you said, there are limitations to leveraging whole foods versus very specific amino acids, and what is that utility, and how can that be utilized? And then I would say that the next question would be, well, what about dosing? For example, what would the appropriate dose be to impact dopamine levels a certain amount? Have you thought about that?
Well, it's a difficult question because the end product of the dopamine and serotonin is in the brain. There's something called the DAT scan now, which is scans for intracellular dopamine in the brain using the CAT scan. And over long term, like months of treatment, it's possible you could see an effect. This approach is used for diagnosing dementia and Alzheimer's now. And that may be possible. It's just a real challenge because with muscle, we can take a biopsy and look at the intracellular concentrations and rates of appearance and so forth. And we don't really know that there's a very direct relation between blood dopamine levels and intrabrain levels, so that we're limited then to performance outcomes, which, as I said, are touch and go because they're a little squishy in terms of how precise they are.
Thank you to Inside Tracker for sponsoring this episode of the show. If you guys are listeners to this podcast, then you know how much I love Inside Tracker. We all age at different speeds. And one of the ways that you can tell how you're aging is really, how does your blood work look? And that is why I love Inside Tracker. You can head on over to inside, like inside your body.com/Dr. Lyon for 20% off. Inside Tracker was created by scientists in aging, genetics, biometrics. It looks at your blood, your DNA, fitness tracking data, really to identify where you need improvement. Because again, we all age, but we don't have to grow old, right? You can age, but you don't have to grow old. And the only way that you are going to determine what is going on in your body is if you test it. And Inside Tracker is making great strides. They just added in the biomarker ApoB, which is critical for heart health, as well as 3 hormone markers that are especially important for addressing symptoms related to aging. They also have insulin, and that is a key biomarker for energy, muscle health, chronic disease. And for a limited time only, you get 20% off the entire Inside Tracker store. Just go to insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon. That's insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon.
So it's been mostly animal studies that have really been the basis of this theory, and then as they extend to human use, it's been more a matter of faith on the rationale provided from the animal studies than being able to directly measure effects, because we can't really get inside the brain to measure the endpoints we're working towards.
Yeah, that would be not ideal. Have you thought about certain foods, for example, that are unbalanced in their amino acids, like bone broth or collagen, things that are actually found in nature? Do you have any thoughts about where potentially that can play a role in some of the factors that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that the potential role, I think that what we're seeing with collagen is that there's some benefit that wouldn't be predicted from the composition of the collagen amino acid structure. And the most likely explanation is that they have some bioactive peptides resulting from the digestion that themselves have a direct regulatory role. That's all been proposed. Not much, and I think that if that turns out to be true, then it opens the door for incorporating that kind of approach, whether it be dietary collagen alone or hydrolysates that have the peptides in combination with other formulations such as essential amino acid formulation that would stimulate protein synthesis might be an avenue. But there do seem to be benefits to collagen that wouldn't be predicted. So I think that's an interesting one to keep an eye on.
Anything else? There's mycoproteins and, they're trying to make proteins out of all different kinds of things. Do you think that there is anything else on the forefront?
Well, I can really only speak to myself. I think it's certainly possible. I mean, people are always looking for something, uh, but the field of protein nutrition is well over 100 years old. So you have to work pretty hard to come up with something that's completely novel, particularly just relying on dietary protein. So we'll see. It'll be exciting if it does. And I think that ultimately where we might be heading is combination of therapies put together into the same kind of approach. But this all hinges on actual experimentation and real data, which unfortunately a lot of what we deal with in this field is a theory without much substantiation. So I think we have to proceed with optimism, but a little bit of caution as to relying on actual experimental data to make any conclusions.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for your contribution to science. You have really impacted so many people. I know that you're up to all kinds of things. If you would love to share, we would love to hear it.
Well, I'm still active at University of Arkansas Medical School on a 30% basis, but most of my efforts have been directed towards research projects to develop amino acid supplementations via the Amino Company, which I'm a founding owner of. So that my comments on the amino acids I've kept in a general sense, so that I haven't been specifically touting anything that the Amino Company sells, but that's been a major focus of mine, and been able to get quite a few NIH grants to specifically develop products to enhance or target specific metabolic circumstances that can benefit from formulations that can't be duplicated with normal dietary protein. But as I said, at the same time, I'm still quite involved. And the fact that I'm in New Zealand most of the time, my associate Paul Maughan, who's the head of this WHO FAO program to develop the DIAS score, that's taken some of my time as well, because I think that there's certainly a major role of dietary protein in proper nutrition, a major role. And so I'm trying to stay active in that aspect as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We will link everything here. We'll link the Amino Company. And I don't know if you have a website, but if you do.
Yeah, there is an Amino Company website.
Yes, you personally. And then if anyone is interested, they can Google you, do a PubMed search on you, and you've published a tremendous amount of research. And again, Dr. Bob Wolfe, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, well, thanks. This has been really enjoyable. We may have gotten too technical at times, but you got me going on some things that I hadn't thought about for a while. So that was really fun.
Well, my audience really, really likes the textile details. So thank you.